Hello, so today we're very excited to welcome as our seminar's Hutton Seminar speaker from the University of Zurich in Switzerland. He's going to be talking to us today about his research in ecological genetics, and we're very much looking forward to it because we feel that his research really spans some of the breadth of the work that we're interested in here at the Institute.
Well, we're all familiar with trade-offs, that is, trying to maximize multiple aspects of say, a crop at the same time. For example, if you want to buy a mobile phone, we know that it's easy to optimize the price of that phone, but if you want to have both a good price and a high quality phone, that's going to be a lot harder. So when a breeder tries to optimize a crop, but also organisms in their during evolutionary processes, we face trade-offs all the time. So we have problems optimizing multiple aspects of an organism, of a crop, and that keeps us from getting the crop we want, that is high yielding, but also allows us to sustainably grow these crops. Now we might think of these trade-offs as actually kind of a nuisance to us, but in fact it turns out that they have very interesting properties. Firstly, they're actually trade-offs. Different trade-offs apply to different levels of biological organization. So trade-offs that a single cell will face are not the same trade-offs that an organism will face. They're not the same trade-offs that a community will face. And by knowing the trade-offs that apply to different levels of organization, we could actually think about improving agricultural system at those different levels of biological organization. For example, by increasing productivity at the plot level through intercropping. That's something that's done here at the James Hutton. A second important aspect of trade-offs are actually that these trade-offs are likely explanatory factors for the species diversity that we see on this planet. So the amazing diversity of species and the coexistence of these species on this planet likely rely on the existence of trade-offs. And that's something I try to understand in my work. So my research is concerned with the molecular nature of trade-offs in plants, one of which is kind of spectacularly obvious in nature and is called the leaf economic spectrum, but also the consequences of trade-offs for community functioning. Studying the causes and consequences of trade-offs, I think, is really studying optimization problems, so problems that we face all the time when we want to improve crop systems or when we want to make agriculture more sustainable. I think there's an urgent need to study trade-offs from a molecular genetic point of view, because the molecular genetics community has neglected the idea of trade-offs in recent times. And I think there's an urgent need that we connect molecular genetics to ecological questions. So in my work, I'm using very simple systems to understand these complicated questions. In my main project, I try to understand simply the question, what are the genetic changes that can lead to increased yield in a new environment, such as the greenhouse on our campus? And surprisingly, I found it's rather easy, genetically speaking, to increase yield in a plant in a new environment, and that there's a diversity of ways, genetically speaking, to increase yield through increased growth of plants, so through increased assimilation of carbon. And these changes also affect metabolism of the plants in very diverse ways. So there's a diversity of ways that plants can increase yield. But to my surprise, I found that there are actually quite strong trade-offs with some structural leaf properties that are evident in these lines. For example, these plants are much more vulnerable to stress. And so this is a trade-off that has been known from ecological research. It's called the leaf economic spectrum. And plants that, even though these genetic changes are very variable and very different in the way they increase yield, they're still bound by these constraints that we observe in ecology. So these trade-offs seem to be much more pervasive than we have thought, because they apply to the single genetic changes in the laboratory. So in the second part of my research, I study the consequences of trade-offs for community level functioning. And in this project, I'm trying to establish the link between trade-offs and positive diversity effects. So positive diversity effects are effects that have been repeatedly found by ecologists that when they increase diversity of species or genotypes at the plot level, they often increase productivity of such a plot, of such a community. And we don't know exactly how this works. We think that plants are specialized and much more efficient at one or the other tasks, and because specialization comes with higher efficiency, this increases the productivity of a community as a whole. But why these species would be specialized in the first place is not quite clear, and we suspect that trade-offs are causal for, or the main cause for these specializations. So I'm taking a quantitative genetic approach to study diversity effects in, again, model plant communities, and I'm trying to establish the genetic basis of diversity effects in these systems. So what I found is that you can basically break these genotypic diversity effects down to specific allelic diversity effects at discrete loci in the genome. So instead of assembling genotypes into communities that then have higher productivity, you can basically assemble genotypes that differ only at very discrete elements into communities and increase productivity this way. And from preliminary data, it seems that trade-offs indeed are responsible for the responsible drivers of such diversity effects. In one case that I studied in more detail, I found that a trade-off between growth and defense, probably the defense of a pathogen in the soil, can actually lead to these positive diversity effects. So really I'm trying to establish a link between the molecular genetics and these processes that ecologists have become very interested in, that maybe also be important more in the future when we try to incorporate intercropping, so the mixture of species in at the field level in our agricultural practice. So we're still a long way from understanding the molecular details and consequences of trade-offs in plants for communities and for individuals. But it's important to study these. It's important for the breeders, first of all, because when we optimize one aspect of a crop, it's important to know what other aspect we might neglect or actually not optimize at the same time. And secondly, the trade-offs, in understanding the consequences of trade-offs for community level functioning is going to be important in the context of the Diversify project that the James Hutton researchers are involved in, where they try to incorporate intercropping system into modern agricultural practices. So I think understanding the exact details of diversity effects and the roles that trade-offs play in these diversity effects is important to the goals of sustainable crop development that are pursued here in the James Hutton.